Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So in this video, we're going to talk about competition. Specifically, we're going to get to an idea in economics we call the invisible hand. So remember what we've done so far is we talked about this idea of prices and how the price system conveys incentives and information and causes individuals to react to the way that the world really is. And another way to phrase this is an idea that Adam Smith calls the invisible hand. Some think of Adam Smith as sort of the forefather of economics. So this works through this supply and demand mechanism. And so remember what we've said, supply and demand is a model and it helps us understand how it is that the world works. But it's worth remembering that I don't want you to think of markets as supply and demand. We want to think of supply and demand as a way to understand markets. We don't want to set ourselves up with sort of an arbitrary view of supply and demand is exactly how it is that the things in the world really work. No, it's the response to prices, these invisible hand, as we're going to explore today, the reaction to cost, reaction to profit, the choices that are being made, and then supply and demand helps us with a framework to understand those things. Okay, so let's recall what it is that we have done in the video that explores firm behavior. We said that the price equal to the marginal cost is the profit maximizing condition, that when the price is greater than average cost, firms enter, and when prices are lower than the average cost, they exit, right? So remember that price greater than average cost is a positive profit, and when the average cost is greater than the price, then we're going to see a negative profit. So positive profit and negative profit. Now, this is what we're saying is the individual best choices for all of the people that are involved from the firm side of the market. What we're going to show in this video is why competition is so important and so valuable, and why we want to be careful anytime that we're going to suggest that we should intervene in a situation based on what the price or the profitability is in something that we're observing in the world. We don't want government policy based solely on what we're seeing in profits, because profits and prices, these things are going to give us good outcomes in those markets. We're going to work out how it is that happens. This is an idea that we're going to call the invisible hand. Okay, so the first thing that the invisible hand does is it minimizes the total industry cost of production. This is a very powerful claim. So notice that what I'm claiming here is it's not that each individual firm goes about doing the best that it can for itself, and that's kind of the highest good that we can attain. No, what I'm saying is the total cost to all of society for an industry producing a particular good is minimized through the market process via competition. So the criteria that we're going to get here is that price will equal the marginal cost for firm 1, firm 2, so on, all the way till however many firms we have, which we've denoted as the marginal cost of firm N. So in a competitive industry, increases in output happen until price is equal to marginal cost. But it's even more important to understand that this is the case for every firm in the same industry, because they're facing the same price. So in a competitive market, we have this condition arise that you're seeing here. Okay, so now let's look at it a little example. Let's start with this notion. The first notion that I want to introduce this to is, what would happen if you have a situation where you have, like, let's say farm A and farm B. And for simplicity, let's start by assuming that you own both farms. You own both farms. And what we can see here is it's much cheaper at any given price level to produce at farm B with marginal cost 2, because that marginal cost curve is much lower at every quantity point, right? So we'll just go ahead and do a quick example. If the price is at this level, right, then the amount that we're going to see produced is much lower here than it is here. So the marginal cost of producing the particular unit in farm B is much lower, right, because we see that the marginal cost for producing at this marginal cost, the quantity that you're producing in farm B is much higher. Okay, so we'll highlight that more here in a second. If that isn't immediately clear to you, don't worry about it too much. Okay, so remember what we're doing here. So this is our firm behavior. We got our price and quantity. We're exploring all these normal things that we're accustomed to exploring. Okay, so let's say you own both Farm A and Farm B, and Farm B, maybe you're gonna go corn. Farm A, it's sort of it's a little bit more hilly, and the terrain is a little rougher and less susceptible to corn, so you can definitely grow corn there, but it's more expensive to do that for each individual unit. Whereas in Farm B, the costs are just generally lower. The land is flatter and easier to extract the water from the ground or bring the water in, however it is that you're gonna go through this. Okay, so now let's say hypothetically, right, that we want to go through and end up producing 200 bushels of corn. Okay, and we do this at first just by producing at Farm B. So let's just do this at Farm B. Okay, so we'll say there's 200 units that we're going to produce. There's 200 units that you're going to produce. Okay, so you can see right away, right, that if we were to produce at the same marginal cost in Farm A, that we would obviously be having a much lower quantity. But something else should immediately arise as an observation to you. Over here, I'm right now producing 0 units, so the marginal cost is that guy right there. So what if, hypothetically, I wanted to come along and say, let's produce a little bit less, and let's go down in the marginal cost, and let's just produce, let's just produce, say, 175 units. 175 units, okay? And in order to produce those units, you want to come over and find what the marginal cost of producing 25 is. Well, it's obvious in this case that there's lots of room along this portion of the marginal cost curve that's below where this intersection was up here. So the marginal cost that we're getting in Farm B is higher than some places, right? So each individual place on the second marginal cost curve in Farm B is lower than the equivalent quantity, the equivalent place on the marginal cost curve in Farm A. But there are still some places in the marginal cost curve of Farm A that are lower than some places in the marginal cost curve in Farm B. So one of the things that might happen is we say, if you own Farm A and Farm B and you just know that it's nicer and easier to produce at Farm B, you just say, well, I'll produce all 200 units there. But we can show that by producing some units, right? Over here, we're producing 175. So now let's say we just want to produce 25 units. That's not going to be very far along this curve. And so you will have lower marginal costs because of this, that you're going to face a lower marginal cost than this equivalent number here. So then now I'm talking about this difference here. This difference here. So what have I highlighted? Producing all 200 units of the corn at Farm B seems like a good strategy, except you notice that then the marginal cost that you face to produce all those units at Farm B is higher than if you produced at least some units at Farm A. Right, so this is taking into account the differential costs that are being faced. In this case, they're physical limitations, right? But we would have lots of other markets where you'd have lots of different types of potential limitations involved. Okay, so let's go back and say, so how many units should it be that are produced between the two different scenarios? Well, the answer in this case, right, we pick whatever numbers it is that it would work out to, but we're going to get a very important criteria, which is when the market price prevails, right? So remember, this would come through and end up being the price, right? And say it says, okay, you've got whatever, 75 units here. And it ends up being 125 units over here. 125 units here. So what's happened? Well, now the marginal cost in both cases is the same. It is the same because the price comes through and says, this is the price that you are facing. How many is it that you can produce that then goes through and maximizes your profit? So what happens? Well, if you look at this and you say, well, how many units should I produce at Farm A? Well, I should produce at the quantity where the price is equal to the marginal cost. Now, the marginal cost 1 as a schedule is in general higher than the marginal cost 2, but there are some points along that marginal cost curve that are equal to the price. In the same way, how many units should I be producing at farm B? Well, also the number equal to the marginal cost. So we can produce a lot more at farm B because the cost is lower. So whatever this prevailing price ends up being, it causes us to produce 125 units, right? It causes us to produce almost double, right? Almost double as many units on farm B as it does on farm A, but we don't produce every unit. We don't produce every unit along the way here at farm B. Instead, we end up producing where both situations are equal to the price. Okay, so now that we have that idea, notice that in this situation, you own both farms. You're sort of like a central planner. This is a government coming in and saying, well, how much should be made? How much should be made? Well, I own farm A, I own farm B, or I guess you own farm A, you own farm B, and you pick between those two things. And you say, well, how do I figure this out? What's beautiful about this, though, is that this gets us all the way back to that situation that we were talking about before, right? Where in this situation, if the price is equal to the marginal cost 1 and the price is equal to the marginal cost 2, the price is equal to marginal cost 1, which is equal to marginal cost 2. That is to say, notice that the marginal cost 1 is equal to the marginal cost of 2. So I've just gotten back to this condition here. The important takeaway then is if I own farm A and you own farm B, we would act exactly the same as if you owned both A and B. Because I would take my set of conditions and I would say, well, here's my marginal cost curve. My land's kind of rocky and hilly. And so if the price is $5 a bushel, then I'll go and produce 75 bushels here. And you have real nice superior land to mine, and you say if the price is $5, then I'll go and produce 125. It's the exact same decision. This is that idea that we talked about with Hayek and Mises and these economists learned early on, that the market outcome, the minimization of total industry cost and production, is of human action, but not of human design. That's why it's so important to remember that we're not going to want to use a central planner because we defeat the points of these things. So the best a central planner can do, this is a point that Stephen Landsberg makes. He's got a little book called Can You Outsmart an Economist? And he presents several little puzzles. One of the neat puzzles that he presents there is exactly this type of idea. Well, how would we go about determining what's the optimal amount to produce? Well, we'd say, well, how many would farm A and farm B produce if we offered them a price of $1 per bushel, right? And farm B's answer would be bigger than farm A, and we just go up. How about price 2? How about price 3, price 4, price 5? And when we got to price 6, right, the farmer in farm B, his answer is going to be different than farm A, and farm A might say, well, okay, my profitability situation has driven me to the point where that's not useful for me to do anymore. And we'll end up with the very best scenario that somebody who is trying to control these businesses, these farms in this case, the best that they can do is what the market naturally does through prices. This is the first effect of the invisible hand, is that it minimizes the total industry cost of production. Remember, we want to think about how grand an idea this is. We're saying we can produce most efficiently. We can take all the different ways that we could organize to produce the goods that we want. And we can't tell very easily by looking, well, how many should farm A produce and how many should farm B produce? The price will naturally cause us to get some from farm A and some from farm B as is necessary. So now what if the farm A price was just astronomical, right? The marginal cost curve was just like way up here or something, right? The answer is they won't produce any there. So there are some situations where that marginal cost is just going to be totally out there. And there's going to be a bunch of farms like farm B, right? They're going to have similar nice low marginal cost curves, and they'll each produce a bunch of those and they'll split the production amongst them. But it's a very powerful effect to say that the total industry cost of production is minimized by allowing the market to have its influence. Okay, what's the second thing that happens? Well, in theory, right, we could minimize the total cost, But we could do that at the wrong amount of the good. The wrong amount of the good. What do I mean by wrong amount of the good? The wrong amount of the good relative to the other goods that we would have, right? So in theory, we could say, well, we end up with the wrong. Yes, we minimize the total cost of producing 200 bushels of corn, but 200 bushels of corn is more than we really want. Well, that's the other thing that the invisible hand, the markets do, is they get us the right industry mix. Let's think for a minute about cars and computers. They both have sort of similar inputs. You got labor, pretty skilled labor in a lot of situations. You have pretty high sophisticated level of capital. Okay, this is where profit comes in. Remember, our profit is our total revenue less our total cost, right? Suppose for a moment that the profitability for computers is higher than that of cars. What's going to happen? Well, one of the things that the people who own the resources, notice that this isn't just businesses, it's households, it's businesses, it's corporations, anybody that is owning resources wants to put those toward their best use. It's exactly what you want to do, it's what I want to do, it's what people who own businesses want to do. Consequently, the profit signal says, well, if your profitability is higher in this industry, then we want to move inputs towards that. This is that same condition as the price being greater than the average cost. It's the same thing as saying your total revenue is greater than your total cost. So in a competitive market, the incentives that entrepreneurs have to seek profit and avoid losses align with the social incentive to move labor and capital out of low-value industries into high-value industries. So this is why I spent so much time discussing the nature of cost and why it's so important to think of that as opportunity cost, and it reflects the value of the alternative uses of the input. So somebody who could be an engineer that works on cars could also be a software engineer, and we could move them towards the production of computers. How do they know whether to do that? Well, it's related to the profitability, the price signals that are happening in the market. So profits encourage entry, right? But when firms enter, the price and the profitability in that market both fall. This is straight out of our last video, right? And so the profitability falls as you get more and more competitors. That's why competition is so important. The price and profitability signal then starts to come down, saying there are more and more resources, more inputs, more labor, more capital in this market. So we want to signal, I say we're anthropomorphizing, right? But this is the magic of the market, of the invisible hand, that there's a signal that discourages more of those inputs from coming into that market. Okay, so what's our conclusion here? Our conclusion is that markets do two powerful things. First, they minimize the total cost of production. They use resources efficiently, which is something we should really value. Right? It takes our limited resources, produces as much as it can with those resources to satisfy as many people's wants and needs as possible. The second thing it does is it gives us the right mix of products. So in a situation when we don't tamper with our markets too much, we end up with a scenario we have the right mix of things, we have the right number of cars and the right number of computers, and we're producing them as efficiently as possible. If either one of these things failed, what would we have, right? We would have, suppose that the first thing failed, right? We might have the right mix of cars and computers, but we don't have as many of them as we could have. People go without cars or computers because we're inefficiently producing them, right? People are made worse off in that scenario. Suppose that we appropriately created as many as we could between one or two of the products, but we got the wrong mix together. We have too many computers and not enough cars. Then we would end up in a scenario where there are still people going without cars, and there are some people that have computers for which the opportunity cost is we could have produced more cars. So people that value the cars more than people value the computers now miss out. Okay, our final idea then is creative destruction. So creative destruction is the idea that you have changes happening in the market, and that will pull resources out of one place, industry, and move them to another place or industry. And that will be sort of painful for the industry that is losing, right? Some people are going to realize my business can't survive because the profit margins are not high enough and I have to go out of business. But that's a signal that the resources that are in that business need to be funneled into a different industry. And in that industry, there's people gaining. They're going and saying, look, there's this high profitability. I should go over here and I should produce more of this. And society is benefiting from this process. That's called creative destruction. This is an idea from an economist named Joseph Schumpeter. Okay, so one of the things that we have to remember is that because there's always going to be change, this economic problem about how much to make with our scarce resources of these different goods and who ends up with those goods, it can't really be solved, right? Remember, one of the things that we've said in this class is that economics, the economy really, more than economics, is dynamic. It's never really being solved. So this process is always happening, right? This is this idea of the learning and discovery process of market behavior, which is why if somebody says to you, listen, just look at the revenues and the costs in the business now, and then you can determine what the price is. So we can't let those guys gouge us with too high of profits. This is a common argument in something like pharmaceuticals or other medical fields. This is a very bad and wrong idea because it misunderstands that profit signals to other people who have resources in other places. If the profit margins are very high, we need to move the profit, we need to move the inputs into the profitable industry. So more people compete, the prices come down, but the amount of production that we have in that particular industry is really high. If you mute the profit signal, you will end up with too little resources going into that use. Okay. The other idea here is the elimination principle, right? And this is basically recitation of what we've talked about with both of these two ideas, right? If you have extra normal profit, you have very high above your opportunity cost profit, it will cause entry, right? And then we're going to see prices go down, and of course profitability will fall. If you have loss, right, then firms will exit. As they do, prices and profitability will rise, helping to stabilize these two mixes between the cost that it takes to produce these goods and the mix of the product that we have. So I hope you guys can grasp the nature of this idea, which is when you see profit or prices, and you say, well, this is bad, these prices are too high, what you're saying is there's something about this signal here that we need to draw more resources in, and the market process will correct the prices that you're seeing prevailing if you are right. If the price is too high, it will come down because firms will produce more of this good, and people will be able to consume more of that good, making society, good or service, any number of things, and society will end up being made better off, and the prices will come down in the process, proving you right. If they're shown that the prices are stable and they're staying at a particular level, absent some kind of intervention in that scenario, what that really means is in that situation, that is at least in the short term, equilibrium price, and we have the appropriate amount of things, right? That is the price that gives a profitability level that matches the opportunity cost of the people that are engaged in that industry.